All right, we are now recording. Okay, and let's go back to the share. This is our April Secondary Methods PD. Welcome, everybody. We have a guest presenter today, Mr. Michael Thompson. Many of you may remember Michael. He presented with our virtual um, monthly PD back in December, and we've invited him back for today. Um, And Michael, I will keep a timer so that at 5 o'clock, I may ask you to pause so that we can let the ELA teachers move to their group. All right.
All right.
But you are now, I'm going to stop my share and then you'll be able to start yours. Okay.
Okay. All right. You have my screen showing,
Yes.
Tim? All
Yes.
right.
Good to go.
Ready to go? All right. Yat A Shea Michael Thompson, Winchbia Wachakia Yinishe, Muskogee Creek Nishla. I'm a enrolled member of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. Um, I'm a retired teacher now and a rancher. But I'm really happy and grateful to CES and LEAP and Tim for inviting me to present to secondary teachers. Most of my life, I was a high school English teacher, and I loved being a high school teacher. As far as I'm concerned, it was the greatest job in the world. I still do a little bit of teaching on the side here and there, like today. But I went back to raising some cattle up on the Navajo Nation in Crystal, New Mexico, about 6 years ago. And that's what I spend most of my time doing now. Um, so the presentation I'm going to do, some of you may have seen parts of this before. I flipped it because I understood that the ELA teachers were going to be leaving after the first 30 minutes. So I put a lot of ELA stuff in the first part. Um, and so that's what we'll start with right now. Um, so one of the main reasons um, I have always advocated for teachers to learn about Native history and Native culture and just the needs of Native students. And in New Mexico, as you know, we're one of the few states that have great numbers of Native students in many of our communities, not every community in New Mexico, but many of them. And for me, a large part of what the challenge is for teachers in the classroom is that many people simply do not know very much about Native people or Native history, um, or some of the characteristics of Native student learning. So this little infographic um, talks about some of those statistics. Uh, the 72% of Americans who never encounter or seek out any information about Native Americans. And the one that has always jumped out to me is the one in the bottom middle that says, when searching Native American, the first 100 Google images are from the 19th century. So it's as though Native people stopped existing in modern times, and that's simply not the case, and it's especially not the case in New Mexico. Um, this study was done at the University of Florida. So, because I was a high school English teacher most of my life, and probably around more than half of that, a lot of my time I was teaching Native learners. I taught at Haskell Indian College in the 70s, uh, but I moved to New Mexico about 25 years ago, and I taught at Bloomfield High School up here near Farmington for 14 years, a majority of Navajo students. and I taught at San Juan College, which has a very large population of Native students from 2012 to 2019 when I retired. So over all of that time when I was dealing with Indian education, a lot of my learning about teaching Native students really came from practices inside my own classroom. I didn't have a lot of college courses in how to teach Native students. Um, so this was all kind of in the classroom, practical experience that I learned. And I have a list here of what I consider Native friendly strategies that I'm going to go through in more detail, but this is the main list. And so one of the first things I think it's important in your classroom to increase cultural representation in the text that you use, the materials you use, and the activities that you practice. I also believe in providing guided student choice in the text that they're reading and in the task that they're completing. This is not a native specific thing, but providing differentiation in those texts and those tasks and those activities is important. I believe in collaboration and using individualized tasks when you're dealing with complex text. I believe in developing native friendly text sets, which I'll talk about for reading across text, valuing background knowledge for native readers. I'm a big believer in color coding, which I'll go into. I think that using visual text is really important, especially for struggling readers and writers. Um, I worked with the National Writing Project for a very long time, and I studied a great deal about text complexity in the text that you're using in your classroom, and we'll talk about that. When I was at Bloomfield, we organized our English department to have a large library of Native resources, of Native novels, of Native short stories, of Native writers generally. And I think every school kind of has that challenge to build up that body of resources. I think it's also important to create protocols for using Native literature because there are cultural considerations. Uh, I really enjoyed having some teacher reading groups for the teachers that didn't know much about Native history or Native literature, so that teachers could read books together and talk about how they would use them in their classrooms. Um, I've done a lot of study on the Native imagery that exists in social media, and I think it's important for Native students to understand something about that. And then I'm a strong advocate of using infographics in the classroom and interactive activities as much as possible. So first topic is increasing cultural representation. And really that requires the teacher to find materials, especially books and print sources and online sources of information and writing and articles about Native people. And so one of the things that I believe is the easiest thing to do is that we have a lot of common news sources for Native communities. And one of the most common are Native newspapers and Native online newspapers. And so here in the northwest corner of New Mexico, there's a very large population of Navajo people. And the Navajo Times is the major newspaper representing the Navajo Nation. It comes out weekly, I think every Thursday. It's also in an online version. And then nationally, Indian Country Today is probably the major resource of Native news for Native people across the United States. And Indian Country Today exists both in a online print form. And recently, in the last few years, Indian Country Today has started to produce television episodes and news coverage, I think on the FX channel. And then in recent years, there have been many, many online and social media sources for Native life. Native people have created podcasts, they have blogs, and so they're relatively easy to find, and you can search for them tribally specific. And then, of course, I think the best source of information about the Native students that you might have in your classroom are to find local Native persons that you may be friends with or you may meet that you can turn to and talk to them about whether it's cultural issues or materials that Native history or materials and resources that they're aware of. This page is just a list of websites that explore Native authors. And Tim, I'm going to ask you, I know in the previous presentations that I've done, the participants had access to a Canva. I think it was Canva. They had access to some of I think I made PDFs of some of these resources. I don't know if that's still true for this group or not.
Yes, if you will, if you'll at the end, like tomorrow, if you'll send me your PDF, just convert it to a PDF, or you can send me your slides and I can convert it, and then we post it in the secondary methods course on Canvas.
Okay, well, I already have the PDFs. I'll just send them to you tomorrow. So the reason I'm mentioning that is that uh, for almost all of these slides, you don't need to be taking notes because I will provide you a PDF that has these sources already in it um, that
Okay.
Tim can make available to you. Um, all right, so I want to talk about guided choice. Um, and what I mean by guided choice is that I do believe strongly that students, and especially high school students, deserve to have choice about the text that they read. And not every text, of course, not the instructional text. But when we're teaching students literature, when we're teaching them novels and collections of short stories, I'm a strong believer that students should have a choice um, in what books those are that they choose to read. And the origin of this for me was I read an article years ago, I think in English Journal, that was titled The Home Run Book. And the author of that article argued that if we want to turn our students into readers, and I know that that challenge is greater today than it has ever been because we're so focused on social media and we have fewer students reading on their own today than ever before. But if you want to turn a student into a reader, the writer of this article argued they have to read the home run book, the book that hits the home run for them. And that may be different for every child. I've been I started teaching in 1977, and I've been in a lot of English departments over the years. And many of those English departments that I worked in had a list of maybe 4, 5, or 6 books that every ninth grader was going to read that year. Every 10th grader was going to read the books in that list, and so on. And I had trouble with that concept, honestly. Uh, I mean, To Kill a Mockingbird is a wonderful novel. I love it. But I'm not sure that To Kill a Mockingbird is the book that's going to hit a home run for every kid. So I went in the other direction. Instead of having a short list of 4 or 5 books, I started creating lists of hundreds of books that my students could choose to read. And when I first started doing this, I had a ninth grade list, a 10th grade list, and so on. But after a year or two of that, I realized, well, that doesn't actually make sense. There's no such thing as a ninth grade book or a 12th grade book. There are just books. And so I took that long list of books and I did break them into level 1, level 2, and level 3 books. So this is from one of the level ones, and this was from years and years ago. So some of these, if I had a list today, I'd have a lot of new books in these lists. But the level 1 list are just easier, shorter books, which ninth graders could read, but struggling 12th graders could read as well. Level 2 books were a little bit more mature. They were more difficult. They were longer. And the level 3 books were, a lot of AP level books, complicated books. But I wanted my students to have choice. But because I wanted them to have guided choice, I chose books for this list that were complex. Many of them are classics, but also across a broad spectrum of genres. So there are books about sports, books about mysteries, horror fiction, um, and also I color coded my list so that the books on this list that are in the red text are books by native writers. The ones in green are by Hispanic writers. Um, and actually, in this list for a level one, there were 2 pages like this. So I think there were probably about 150 books or so. Um, and my goal, I took my students to the library every marking period, every quarter. And their objective was to choose one book from this list that they would read during that quarter. Um, and after they'd gone to the library, I would also do book talks to kind of give them an idea about what some of these books were, and recommend some books. But after we came back from the library, I would talk to them maybe after the first 3 or 4 days or a week, and I would ask them, how's that book going for you? Is that book working for you? Because if that book wasn't working, I would say, we'll go back and get a different book. Because my sole goal was to find a book that that student wanted to read. And so, with lots of choice, with a little bit of guidance, and being persistent, and over time, I would get to know their preferences a little bit. I had a lot of cowboy kids when I taught at Bloomfield, and I would guide them towards some westerns, some great westerns that they could read. Um, and to me, over time, learning about my students and the kind of books they like to read and trying to match the right book with the right student made all the difference in the world. And so I also wanted to do differentiation and choice in what they had to do once they'd read that book. And I had a lot of teachers who would question me sometimes, and they would say to me, um, how can you assign a book that you've never read yourself? And I said, well, first of all, most of these books I have read. But second of all, you don't have to read every book cover to cover to understand the nature of that book and whether it's going to resonate with that student. And there's a way to create activities so that the student can process the book kind of in their own way. So for every time my students would get one of those books to read during a marking period, I would give them a set of assignments like this, and it would change every quarter. I would not do the same assignments over and over because when I began teaching, every teacher that assigned a book, they would have kind of a template for a book report. And they would talk about the characters and they would talk about the plot. They would talk about the same thing. And the student would have to write over and over, whatever book they read, the same kind of little essay book report. And it really wasn't directing those students to dig deep into the book for different elements. So I would give my students this assignment, and they would have to pick one activity from section one from section two, one from section three, and one from section four. And so they had a choice of 4 activities to choose from. And having differentiation means some of those activities are harder than others. And sometimes you had students who needed the easier assignment, and they could self-select the one that was best suited to what they felt they were capable to do. Um, and so this differentiation of both the book they were reading and then the activities they had to complete about that book made it far more likely that every student was going to complete an appropriate activity and process that book. And I'm not going to lie to you and say that they immediately were able to do this with the first book. But over time, what happened was they chose more appropriate books for themselves. And over time, they chose more appropriate activities for themselves. Um, and it just made life much better for me as their English teacher. And it also helped those students find the kind of literature they enjoyed reading. And to me, that was the goal. Um, I also created this list. I called it Thompson's 10 Dimensions of Literature because, and one of those activities required them to write about one of these dimensions about the book they had read. And again, it goes back to that they weren't just writing a book report. Every book is different, every novel is different. And so some novels have elements that other novels do not have. Um, so some novels are funny, some novels are tragic. Some novels, like The Red Badge of Courage, are based in a historical event. Some novels have unusual linguistic elements. Some novels are scientific or technological in the world that they create. So I wanted my students to also understand that they had choices here of different lenses in which to read a book. That's what this list was for. Um, I'm also a big believer in having el
Is that you?
having elements that
Miss Manlegro, he's over here.
having elements that allow the teacher to manage time in their classroom. Because I know as well as anybody that time is precious, and you don't have time often to cover everything that you're tasked with covering. So anything you can do to shorten the time it needs to complete a project or discuss a book is time saved for you as the teacher to dig deeper into things. Um, so I believe in using collaboration, differentiation, and creating individualized tasks to read complex text like a complicated poem or a complicated short story or a passage in a novel. Um, so I'm going to show you an example with a poem by Navajo writer Lucy Tapahanso. And this poem is titled In 1864. I'm going to go ahead and show you the entire poem. It's on this page and the next page. Okay, so it's about a 6-column poem, and it's a fairly complex poem. Uh, and I have color coded this poem because I'm going to talk about color coding more later. But I color coded different parts, sections of this poem. So this poem is about the long walk of the Navajo people that was made in 1864 to a place called Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico, about 300 miles from the Navajo Nation. And in the poem, Lucy Tapahanso is telling a story about driving in a car with her family. And then the yellow highlighted part is when they're starting to talk about the trip to Bosque Redondo. She recalls this man she knew who was an electrician. And so he has his own little narrative that this is about. And then in the unhighlighted text at the end of that page, the journey continues. But in the journey, in the turquoise highlighted part here, I think it's the grandmother, begins to recall stories she knew about the actual long walk, about what happened to the people when they made that march. And then at the end of the poem, it goes back to the car journey again, the people that are riding in the car that she's telling the story about. So as you can see, it's a relatively complicated poem. It's not a simple poem that you could just read and discuss in 15 minutes and move on. It has lots of parts. So what I would do with my students, I believed in almost always with my high school students, I had them sitting in triads or in quads. So 3 students or 4 students in a little group every day. And I would change those groupings from not every day, but from time to time, every week or so. So they'd get to know different students or for different purposes of different kinds of activities. But I did believe in having my students work in groups like regularly. And so for this poem, I would have assigned either, in smaller groups, I might have assigned individual students one of these tasks. But sometimes I might have a little group of 3 students or 4 students do one of these tasks. And again, there's differentiation. Some of these tasks are very, very simple. Some of them are a little bit more complicated. But if I assign groups one of these tasks to complete, it would take that group maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the most to complete. So, for example, write a numbered sequence of the events that occur in the electrician's narrative. So the yellow highlighted part about this man who was an electrician, just to do the sequence of things that happened to him wouldn't take very long for that one little part. And so having the different groups complete one of these tasks would take a very short period of time. And then the entire class would come back together and each group would talk about their task and what they had learned. So the whole class could process this poem probably in 30 minutes. And it would go much more quickly than if the entire class was doing each one of these things one at a time. So it's both working with differentiation, trying to find the right task for the right group, and it's also trying to manage time so that the entire class can move through the text as quickly as possible. And so you saw a little example of color coding in that poem that we looked at. This is another example of color coding that I would use. This essay, actually it was a newspaper column called Cowboy Down, and it was from Los Angeles Times newspaper, which is a fairly complex, sophisticated writing back in 2006. And the article is really about a bull riding competition that happened in the arena, the hockey arena in Anaheim, California in 2006. But it's about bull riding. And it's, as I said, it's a complicated, probably college level text. So if I wanted my students, and this really is the first 3 paragraphs of about a page and a half column, but if I wanted my students to focus in and understand different elements of that text, I would color code for them specific things I wanted them to see, and then we would unpack the specific element. So in this essay, this color coding is for critical terms. So if they were going to understand it, they would have to know like reindeer dipping is the name of the bull, and bulls weigh around 1,550 pounds. They'd need to know what the PBR was. They would need to know why X 8 seconds is important in bull riding. So I would highlight critical terms that we as a class would then unpack. But if there were different things I wanted them to pay attention to, like the figurative language, I would highlight and color code different parts of the essay. So I went through this and highlighted in yellow just all of the parts that are metaphorical or figurative language that we would all have to unpack. And by doing this different color coding, I could have divided them up into groups for this kind of an activity. But really, it's so that English language learners can focus on specific parts of a text, and then as a class, we can unpack them together. So that's another example of color coding. I'm going to check here and see. I'm not sure if this. Let me get back. Not sure if the audio is going to play on this. So Tim, I'm going to need to test that and then have you
Test it,
tell
and then
me.
I'll see if there's something I need to do.
Okay.
I don't hear
We
anything.
are all
Oh, there it
children
is.
born of water. It is where all life begins. Water embraces and protects us We revere it in our homes. We need to live close to water. It nourishes and cleanses us. All living things know this. Sometimes water is gentle and floats in the air. Sometimes water is harsh and colorful. Sometimes it catches the sun's rays. Water changes with the seasons, alive and always moving, even when no one is looking. Water is patient. Water endures. Water brings clarity. Water purifies our thoughts. Water brings us together. Water is holy. Water helps us heal. Water is medicine.
Okay, so I want to say a few things about that little video clip. I believe even long before I left the high school classroom many years ago, I think my students were fascinated by visual text, whether it was a clip from a movie, things they watched, video games they played. I know that our students are visual students. But I don't think, and I think it's very important for us to use as many visual elements in our classrooms as we can. And I would say to you, as a generation of teachers who've grown up in a media saturated environment, you have access to bring into your classrooms so many incredible visual pieces, visual text, visual elements that years ago, we were struggling to do with an overhead projector. So you have access to incredible visual elements, and they don't need to be long. That's another thing. I love movies, but I rarely showed entire movies in my classroom. I might show a segment from a movie that we would, like a Romeo and Juliet film. We might discuss segments from that film, but I wouldn't take the time to show the entire 2-hour film in my classroom and then spend days unpacking it. I might show a 15-minute clip that we might spend, a classroom session or two discussing. This little clip, one of the reasons I like it is my wife does the voiceover for this clip, and my friend John Hosteen created this little video for John Hopkins University's health outreach to Native people. And what I would like, I'm going to play it again. I'm going to go back and I'm going to play it again. What I'd like you to do is just look at it. And it doesn't really matter what grade level you teach or what subject you teach. I want you to think if there's a tiny way you might use this little clip to teach something in your own classroom. Okay? Well, let me just go back.
We are all children born of water. It is where all life begins. Water embraces and protects us. We revere it in our homes. We need to live close to water. It nourishes and cleanses us. All living things know this. Sometimes water is gentle and floats in the air. Sometimes water is harsh and colorful. Sometimes it catches the sun's rays. Water changes with the seasons, alive and always moving, even when no one is looking. Water is patient. Water endures. Water brings clarity. Water purifies our thoughts. Water brings us together. Water is holy. Water helps us heal. Water is medicine.
Okay. I'm not going to take the time to hear what you might have thought of, but I believe that many of you could think of a way that you could use this, even if it were just as an introduction to a science lesson that had to do with water. And I'm sure there are mathematical problems you could create around water as well. And in social studies, there's so much to talk about in terms of water rights and access to water and how water affects civilization. So just what I want you to think about is how visuality can be critical to engaging students. Okay. Next thing I want to switch to is talking about text sets. So one of the things I know about teaching a complicated piece of literature can be that students don't have any background knowledge for it. And when I was teaching at Bloomfield High School, I did a unit on literature from Vietnam about the Vietnam War. We had a Vietnam memorial outside our high school, and many of my students had no idea who that person was, a young man that died in the Vietnam War, and they didn't know anything about Vietnam. So when we began to read this short story, Ambush by Tim O'Brien, based on an episode in the Vietnam War, I realized I needed to create a text set because they didn't have any images in their head about the war. They didn't know who was fighting the war. They didn't understand the cultural significance that affected so many people in my generation. So a text set, I gave them an internet article about Vietnam called Vietnam 101. I gave them some letters home from soldiers that were in the Vietnam War writing home. I gave them some cartoons about the Vietnam War. I gave them a poem by a Vietnamese refugee. I gave them President Nixon's Cambodia speech that was on TV. And I showed them some clips from a couple of movies like Forrest Gump and the Beatles movie Across the Universe that all had images from the Vietnam War. And I realized there were so many things they didn't know. And they even struggled with the comic strip because in the comic strip they talked about Charlie and body counts and commies and gooks. So reading these and looking at these 5 or 6 different texts gave them a body of knowledge that they could read across text to make sense out of the short story that they were reading. So they had a better understanding of what the Vietnam War was. Oops, I'm going to go back. So I think the important thing is text sets provide a quick way to build background knowledge. And students need background knowledge to understand many, many complicated things that they're learning in schools. And if they don't have any context for it, you can create a context with some visual images, with some very short pieces of material about the topic that you're discussing. And there's so many things in science. There's many things in math and social studies. These little bits and pieces that collectively in a little set can provide your students with context for understanding whatever it is that you're really focusing on. So here's a definition of text sets. You want texts that are related to the thing you're focusing on. And you want to make sure they provide engagement, they're age appropriate, they have support for English language learners. Will they build background knowledge? Are they authentic and high quality? So I think, really important original pieces from the time period can be very helpful. Are they accurate and meaningful? Do they build diverse perspectives on a subject? And is it easily available for you to share with students? Because again, you want You want to make things easy for yourself, not more complicated. And I'll just throw this in here about text complexity. When I was working with the National Writing Project, I studied, and this was back during the era of Common Core, but I studied a great deal about what makes a text complex and difficult. So there are obvious things, word length. Lexile scores are helpful, but they're quantitative measures, not qualitative measures. They won't tell you everything. Forms, like whether the text is a narrative form or expository, is it poetic, is it analytic? Does the text have charts, illustrations, and graphs? If you're dealing with English language learners, are there a lot of idioms in there? Because those are really cause problems for English language learners. Text with dialogue or without dialogue. Text from earlier times. So if you go back in time to even the 18th century, there's a lot of language we don't use today, they used back then. And then if you're studying science, text with lots of technical terms and jargon, those are things you're going to have to be aware of as you choose text or as you talk to the students about text. And then again, those that require a lot of background knowledge, that's when you may have to start building those text sets to help students understand.
Michael,
Yep.
I'm gonna pause here for the ELA teachers to go ahead and use look in the chat, and you have your link to Margot's ELA session. You guys can be excused now.
Okay, although
Hold on. Go ahead, Margot.
what Mr. Thompson teaching is really phenomenal. In fact, I'm
Perfect.
learning a lot. So, people, please stay on. And then I don't know how, and then when this session ends, we'll move to to the ELA session. But you're getting phenomenal information here that I don't want you to miss.
Okay.
Thank you, Margot.
Oh, no, I'm learning. Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll push on forward. Probably in about 15, 20 minutes. We'll take a 5-minute break because I'm going to switch over to the second PowerPoint. But I'll go ahead and finish this one. There's probably 15, 20 minutes left. Okay.
That works for me. I can just slice and dice a little. As I said, I think for ELA teachers, this is phenomenal information, and the culturally responsive pieces are wonderful. So we should be learning this.
Thank you. All right. So I'm also a big fan of infographics. And, an infographic is really some form of illustrated knowledge that compresses a great deal of information into some sort of illustrative form. This particular example is not a great example. It's just lots of little bits of information that includes some photographs, but it covers some very, very useful information if a student wanted to learn something about what are powwows, right? So it's got some strong visual elements, the colors, it's got some photographs, but again, I'll go back. Time is important, and infographics, and I've got a little bit more information later about more detailed information about infographics. But the great advantage of infographics is they can convey information to someone who knows nothing about a topic with a really good illustration in a very short amount of time. So something to remember. I've got a couple of slides here of things that were important to me as a secondary teacher. And I know there are a million sources of information on teaching out there in the world, but I'm going to tell you 5 of my favorite websites that I return to again and again for information about certain subjects and for strategies and techniques and great articles. So the first one is TED Ed. It's the kind of educational focused part of TED Talks. I use TED Talks occasionally in my classroom. When I found one that was appropriate to the subject that I was teaching, I used them when I taught at San Juan College in my composition classes. Um, but there are just great, wonderful talks on many, many different subjects. And TED Talks is pretty well archived, so you can find information on topics that you're interested in pretty easily. I think probably my favorite website that's just about teaching generally and about technology in teaching is Edutopia, um, edutopia.org, because they have great articles, they have great lists of resources, they can link you to other helpful websites. So I'm really strong believer in Edutopia. I think most people are familiar with Khan Academy. I'm not sure that all teachers are aware um, that they can use Khan Academy themselves um, to understand better how to teach a particular thing. When I worked with elementary teachers, because I was not an elementary person in my career, um, especially if I were an elementary math teacher teaching math, I would direct my teacher candidates to Khan Academy so that they could go find this second grade skill and see how Khan Academy taught that skill. Because the little videos and the demonstrations are wonderful for teaching many kind of micro lessons about many subjects. And so Khan Academy, just for your own knowledge as a teacher, there probably are teachers who may show some Khan Academy videos and show their students this is how Khan Academy does it. But I think just for the teacher's own knowledge, Khan Academy can show you how to teach many, many, many things. And again, it's well archived, so you can find the topic that you need to learn. And then just, I think, especially for ELL teachers, read, write, and think.org is a great site that has lots of lessons on literature and composition. And then the Annenberg Foundation created Annenberg Learner at learner.org, which is another really great, helpful website. I want to share with you 3 videos. These were videos that I would, when I had classes that were completing their alternative licensure, my candidates who had had their observations and were going out into the classroom, I wanted to step up their game a little bit. And I wanted them to think about some complicated things in education. And all 3 of these are TED Talks. And these are probably my 3 favorite TED Talks that I've ever used for secondary teachers. And one is by a man named Manuel Lima. And he really, in this TED Talk, he talks about how for years we had the metaphor of the tree of knowledge, how many disciplines, say biology, there's a tree of knowledge. It has all of these branches, um, genetics, and evolutionary branches that branch off. And what Manuel Lima does is he says that today, that tree of knowledge metaphor is very, very outdated because now we are understanding knowledge across the board, across the universe, are in interconnected networks of things. And he does an excellent job of explaining that so that it's a much more sophisticated way about thinking how different aspects of knowledge are interrelated. Likewise, David McCandless has a wonderful TED Talk on infographics, on data visualization. And while this TED Talk is, I don't know, maybe a decade old now, he still explains how data has been compressed into visual illustrations that show us and help us to understand very complicated things. And then the third one, Josh Kaufman's TED Talk on the first 20 hours, how to learn just about anything in 20 hours. I used to do test prep for teachers preparing for the praxis exams and some of the earlier teacher tests. Um, and I worked with teachers who had maybe taken the praxis 5 or 6 times. And every time they took the test, their score was probably within the same 10-point range because they weren't doing anything different between their test takings. They were just hoping that the next time they did it, they would do better. And honestly, that's not going to happen unless you do something in between the test taking tries. You have to learn new information. And the core to what Josh Kaufman says about how you can learn almost anything in 20 hours, the key to that is understanding and identifying what are the core aspects of that skill. And I'll give you the simple example I did in my test prep. If you're trying to pass a basic skills English language arts test, and they're at all levels, there's basic skills in high school, there are basic skills English tests when you go to enroll in college. There are basic skills English tests for teachers. They all have about 5 elements. So they have grammar, they have punctuation, they have usage, right? So those core elements, each one of them has maybe 5 or 6 core components within the basic skills. And so what Kaufman would say is first you need to identify those core skills and then dig down into the next level of what are the core elements of those core skills and focus on studying those. And then he would say, and I agree with him, if you do that for 20 hours, you can pass that basic skills English test because you will have focused on all the right things. So 3 videos I encourage you all to watch. This last screen, I made this list yesterday. So what I wanted to do was, because I knew I'd be talking to a bunch of talented secondary teachers, and having been a secondary teacher most of my life, these are the things, some of the basic things I consider important as you go forward in your teaching career. So I would say, number one, consider project-based learning. I worked at a math and science school, the California Academy of Math and Science, in the mid-90s out at the Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. And we did project-based learning, interdisciplinary projects, every grade level, every year, all year long, that were social studies, science, math, and English. And we had some big year-long projects. But I've also done project-based learning in a unit within a quarter in almost all of the classrooms that I had at Bloomfield High School. I'll give you 2 simple examples. When I taught in California, I had my 10th grade students read Jurassic Park. And we had a project, they divided up into teams, and we divided the novel up, and they had to go through the entire novel. Different teams had different sections, and they annotated the novel Jurassic Park to identify the science elements that were real and those that were invented. And that's really what science fiction is. But some of the science in Jurassic Park is absolutely real. And some of it, Michael Crichton made up. He invented it. And so their job was to separate fact from fiction, basically, and to have a scientific basis for it. And it took maybe, I don't know, 2 weeks. But we ended up with an annotated handbook for Jurassic Park. And they loved it. When I taught at Bloomfield High School, I taught Frankenstein. And one of the units that I gave there's a journey in Frankenstein from Geneva, Switzerland, I think, to the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland. And there are places mentioned in Europe all along that journey down the river. And we chose about 10 or 12 cities in Europe. And then I had my students divided up into their teams. and each team had to plan a trip and a budget for travel to spend a week at that particular city. So they had to study about the cities, they had to learn about international travel, they had to plan cost for ship travel or plane travel for hotels. Just in terms of practicality, it taught them a lot of real life lessons, taught them a little bit about the geography of Frankenstein, but my goal was for them to be engaged. So, project based learning. Second thing is don't ignore the value of self assessment. We do a lot of testing as teachers, but not that often do we ask students, what did you learn? I had a very simple rubric I used before I'd start a new unit. Here's the 10 things we're going to study this unit. And I would give them a self evaluation. And the 4 things were I'm clueless, I know a little bit, I know a lot, or I'm an ace. So they'd sit down and they'd rank themselves on these 10 things they had never, we hadn't studied yet in class. So they'd create their little profile. At the end of that unit, I would come back and they would evaluate themselves the same way again. And so it was very rare that someone had not moved somewhere from clueless to I know a little, sometimes to I know a lot, or maybe I know a little and now I'm an ace. So they would create their own self evaluation. I didn't need to use that in grading. I needed the students to see that for themselves so that when we studied a thing, they could move in their own sense of what they knew to a better place. And don't underestimate the value of that. It's good for students to believe, hey, I learned something. So, self evaluation. Third thing is develop a personal stance on grading. The bottom line about grading is parents want it, administrators want it. I'm not sure how much students want it, but there's a lot of pressure on you to create grades. And what I would say is think really hard about what's the purpose of a grade in your classroom. Most of the time, I think many teachers are grading compliance. How much did the student do that I told them to do, whether it's homework or completing a project or writing an essay? And I think you need to think hard about, do my grades reflect what my students learned or whether they just complied with what I told them to do? That's critical. And I think there are ways to satisfy parents, administrators, and students with grades, but you need your own beliefs about it to be strong. Next thing is look as far down the road as you possibly can. And I'm talking here mostly about big shifts in education. I lived through the years of Common Core. I wasn't opposed then to Common Core. I think there are a lot of good things about it. It's pretty much gone now. But the truth about Common Core was 3 years before it arrived, everybody knew it was coming. And there were teachers who just didn't want to prepare for it. So when it finally did arrive, they were not ready for the shifts that had been coming for 3 years down the line. Another kind of shift that comes down the line that you can see coming is technology. Not all technology has been the magic bullet that we thought it would be. I remember when computer labs came into high schools. So computers were coming. It took us 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years to make good use of those computer labs. Then I believe that smart boards in classrooms were way oversold. Smart boards didn't change a whole lot of teaching that I saw. What did change was linking a projector to a computer so that whatever I could show on my computer, I could show my students in front of the classroom. That was a big shift for me. Then we had cell phones, and there was a lot of tinkering around with whether teachers were going to use students with cell phones to do quick quizzes and use them in classrooms. Personally, I haven't seen any major revolutions from cell phones' presences in classrooms, but I do know what you guys are going to have to deal with that you need to start thinking about right now, and that's AI. Some of you probably are already thinking about it. If you're not, you better, because that's coming down the line and it's coming fast. So I just think teachers have to look ahead to what's coming next and read your professional journals, talk to other teachers, because you can prepare for these things, but you have to have foresight. The next one, kind of obvious, I think, create your own personal archive for everything. I have probably tens of thousands of electronic files on my teaching of the last 30 years. I didn't throw anything away, I archived it. Some of the things that are in this PowerPoint were from 15 years ago because it's part of my archive of my teaching career. So, whatever you teach now, you may not use it, but 5 years from now, you might have a thing that you want to find. So, create your own personal archive. Next one, remain a lifelong learner of the subjects that you teach. Sometimes we go through teacher training and we learn how to manage a classroom, we learn how to do assessments, we learn all of the tools about teaching itself, and then we have to go into a classroom and we have to teach 17th century literature, or we have to teach economics, or we have to teach fourth grade math. We're not always prepared for those things, and there are like two or three main ways you build that knowledge over time. A lot of it is your own hard work and research and reading. Some of it comes from your colleagues who teach those subjects. But keep building your knowledge of whatever that subject is, about math, about science, about English, because you never know it all. And you can always learn more and get better at learning how to teach it. So, subject matter, the discipline knowledge, is really something in your control. Nobody's going to show up and teach it to you. You're going to develop that knowledge pretty much on your own by reaching out and doing it over a lifetime. Prepare to learn about various disabilities. I know you're probably going to have some courses in special education. All I'm saying about this is sooner or later in every classroom, you're going to have maybe just one student or a few students with very specific disabilities. And what I'm going to tell you is you're not going to be prepared for everyone. You're not going to have the knowledge of all the various disabilities, whether it's visual impairment or muscular sclerosis or a student with seizures. You're not going to have that ahead of time for all of those disabilities. But if you have compassion and you're willing to learn when that student shows up in your classroom, you'll get through it and they will help you and their parents will help you. And you can teach students with almost any kind of disability, but you have to be open to it. And like I'm saying, you won't always be prepared, but they will be wonderful students that you can learn to teach. And then finally, the last thing is in your classroom, value social interaction. We're dealing with a generation of students who spend most of their time on social media. And you know the statistics about depression and about them feeling disconnected. So your classroom is the best place to build community. So the more activities you have for them to work together, the more activities you have that creates a sense of community and acceptance inside your classroom, and make those students feel welcomed and to know that they are a community and they can work together. I think that's a critical thing, and I believe learning happens when students interact. More learning happens when students interact. Um, so learn about the value of social interaction. So I'm gonna think maybe we'll take a 5-minute break, Tim,
Sure.
and those ELA teachers who were here, love you guys. Good luck. All right. I'll stop my, let's see.
You can leave your slides on and I'll just pause the recording for now.
I'm Muskogee. I'm a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. My grandfather was named Wesley Johnson. He was a full-blood Muskogee man, and my mother raised me and my 5 siblings in South Georgia. We moved from Oklahoma when I was a child, but I still, even though I didn't grow up in Oklahoma until I was 3, these are people in my tribe that have been inspirations to me. So Will Sampson, the actor that was in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and some other Westerns. Sterling Harjo, who's a filmmaker that made the TV series Reservation Dogs. He and I share the same hometown, Holdenville, Oklahoma. And then Joey Harjo, who was the first Native Poet Laureate of the United States. These are all Muskogee people. So I always have to give a shout out to my Muskogee side. I'm going to do a real brief explanation of why Native representation in classrooms matters to me. When I was at Bloomfield, and I first moved there in 1998, many years later, I did a survey. I got a grant to do a survey of high school students and high school English teachers about the importance of teaching Native literature compared to other literature. And Bloomfield had 40% Native students, mostly Navajo. And when we did this survey, if you look, the light blue at the bottom where those students found teaching Native literature very important, that's mostly the Native students. And then the bar in the middle, equally important for Native, Hispanic, and Anglo students. And that's to be expected. That was kind of a neutral. But then at the top, many Anglo and Hispanic students thought it was completely unimportant. So those Navajo students I had in the classroom, their literature, nobody thought was very important. Or there were definitely students who were not Native who thought it was unimportant. I should say that. Then I surveyed them about, well, what are the Navajo writers that you have read in your English classes? And there were hardly any. Most of the students had read no literature by Navajo writers. And it is not as though there are not Navajo writers, because there are. All of these names across the bottom, they're excellent Navajo poets. They just hadn't read any of those in their classrooms. And in the summary of that survey, nearly 80% of the students at the high school indicated they had read no Navajo authors, and almost a fifth of the high school teachers in San Juan County said they had never read a book by a Navajo writer. And that's despite the fact that we have majority, some schools, majority Navajo across San Juan County. And what I know is that truth had existed probably since those schools began. And I will tell you the truth, today, about 15 years later, I imagine if I did this survey in those classrooms, the same classrooms, I don't think the results would have changed much. I don't believe that there are many high school English teachers teaching Navajo literature in the schools that in San Juan County where I live, where my granddaughters go to school. And to me, we can do better than that. And we should do better than that. That's probably one of the reasons we have the Yazzie Martinez case in New Mexico. And I imagine that many of you know about the Yazzie Martinez case. In 2018, The Yazzie Martinez case was ruled that yes, in fact, the New Mexico state of New Mexico is failing its low-income students of color and English language learners. And that was nearly 7 years ago. I don't think a whole lot has changed since then either. I haven't seen, I go in classroom schools and do observations. I'm in and out of classrooms. I don't think much has changed. So I just think we all need to be more aware of who the Native people are in New Mexico. So I'm going to give you, this is a big picture overview. New Mexico has close to 250,000 Native American citizens. So that's about 11% of the population in New Mexico. This next part's really important. There are 23 tribes located in New Mexico, but you need to differentiate your understanding of what that means, because 19 of those tribes are pueblos. If you know anything about the Pueblo people, they're relatively small communities, but each one is its own sovereign nation. Then there are 3 Apache tribes, which are scattered out geographically widely apart from one another, that are perhaps larger in number than the Pueblo tribes individually, but not nearly as large as the Navajo tribe, which spans 3 states and hundreds of thousands of square miles. But each of those tribes is considered a sovereign nation. And sovereignty is critically important to understand about Native people. So here's a map of where these tribes are. And you can see way down at the bottom, the Mescalero Apache Reservation in Ruidoso. And then actually, there's another small Fort Sill Apache Reservation, tiny reservation that's an Apache tribe down in the south. And then the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, which is way at the top of the state in the north. Then all of these little red diamonds in the north from Albuquerque up to Taos are all of the Pueblo tribes. And then that includes the Zuni, which are way over on the west. And then the Navajo Nation, of course, which extends into Arizona and Utah. And then these are the languages that are spoken by those tribes. And if you look at the bottom, we'll start with that, because that's the Athabascan language. And that Athabascan language is spoken both by the Navajo tribe and the Apache tribes. And they have relatives up in the Arctic and in Canada that also share this language. So the Athabascan language is shared by Apaches and Navajos, and then they share with tribes in the north of the United States. And then all of these other tribes, Keres, Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, and Zuni, they're Pueblo languages, but they're spread among those 19 Pueblos. So, and it's also important to know that in the Pueblo tribes, generally, they don't believe in teaching the written language. They believe in oral language instruction. The Navajo tribe does have a written form that's taught and studied. And so that may be partly explained by the fact that Pueblos are in small communities where everybody in the Pueblo sees each other on a regular basis. And Navajos are spread geographically across a very wide area. But it's important to know how these different tribes feel differently about teaching their own languages. And then in terms of New Mexico's school data, we do have in New Mexico 23 school districts and 10 charter schools that identify as Native serving. There are almost 41,000 American Indian students in public schools in New Mexico, about 10% of the public school population. but there are only about 3,500 teachers who identify as Native. Then there's another small um, population, 6,700 American Indian students that are taught in BIE, and so which are federal Indian schools, and tribally controlled schools like Navajo Prep here in Farmington that's funded by the Navajo Nation. And the PED has really good, accurate information about the percentages of Native students in different school districts, if you ever need to look that up. And then I just want to emphasize sovereignty again. All of the various tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, native communities, native villages in Alaska are all considered sovereign nations. If all of those were put together in the United States, it would make Indian country the fourth largest state in the United States. So there's fairly large land masses cumulatively. And sovereignty at the bottom is a very simple thing. It's the authority to self-govern. And it's all created from the treaties that were made with the United States since the beginning of the United States nation. All right. So sovereignty is very important. Here are some other things highlighted in blue that I consider, if you're working in Native communities, that you need to be aware of. So we have very complicated land and water issues, especially the water issues. You all know, living in the Southwest, water is critically important. And we have lots of water agreements where tribes are in conflict with the states, and then occasionally in conflict with the federal government about who has rights. And some of these rights have been established in treaties. Most of these rights have been established in memorandums and compacts between states and tribes and the federal government. So wherever you live in a Native community, water rights issues are problematic. I just talked a little bit about how different the tribes in New Mexico can be from one another. A lot of non-Native people think that most Native people are kind of all similar, and they're not. The customs, their communities, their practices about land, about language can be very, very different. Even in a state like New Mexico, where we have many Native people, but the tribes have very strong differences from one tribe to the next. Then intergenerational trauma is a real thing, and it's affected language. So you might have students, Native students in a classroom, who don't speak their native language, and that's largely because not their parents, but their grandparents were told not to speak their language, so their grandparents didn't teach the language to their parents. So we have multiple generations then where you have language loss. And it's not going to come back quickly or easily, but I think many, many tribes in the country today have language restoration efforts that are ongoing. New Mexico is probably the best, one of the 2 or 3 best states in the nation for supporting native language restoration, and to teach native languages in schools through dual language programs and immersion programs. But we've had a lot of language loss, and I'm not sure we're ever going to get it back. And then finally, the last thing is the urban reservation divide. So it's one thing to be a Native student and a Native family in an urban community like Albuquerque or Cruces. And then it's another thing to be living on the reservation, say in Gallup, McKinley County, where your family lives on the reservation, where unemployment may be 50%. So they may be both a Navajo on the reservation and a Navajo in Albuquerque, but their living circumstances, because one's in a city and one's on the reservation, can be very different. And it also affects their ability. They might want to engage in ceremony, But if they live far away from the reservation, that may be very difficult for a family to accomplish. I want to talk briefly about Cornell Pewawardi. Basically, the idea behind Cornell Pewawardi's research is that Native students are likely to be field dependent. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into what that means. Whoops. Field dependence. Oh, I'm not going to be able to go back. Field dependence means that the student learns from the whole to the part rather than from the part to the whole. Students who are kind of from Western cultures can take things that are divided into parts and put them together into the whole, but field-dependent students kind of look at everything in regards to a whole and then understand its parts. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. So I think it's also important for teachers in classrooms to develop their own cultural frames of reference and really mainly to understand things like cultural taboos. There's an excellent publication resource. Let me go. That resource was created by the Navajo Nation and I think the Game and Fish Department of Arizona. But they talk about all these different animals and what are cultural beliefs by the Navajo about that animal, and then what's appropriate for use and discussion of that animal in the classroom. And so there's dozens and dozens of these. You can access this particular PDF, I think, online. It'll teach you a lot about Navajo taboos. But there are other taboos too, not just about animals in the classroom. So I'll give you some examples. Schools and classrooms often have activities around, say, an eclipse. And a lot of schools around here take field trips, let's say, to Puebloan ruins, like Chaco or Aztec ruins. And not all Native families feel like their child should be taken to those places. And my family, when they had the eclipse this past year, I have two granddaughters. In our family, Navajos believe when an eclipse happens, you stay inside and you pray or you meditate, you remain quiet, you don't go outside. But unless teachers send some sort of information home and ask and make that inquiry about whether it's appropriate for their students to participate in those activities, then the child feels pressured. And all I'm saying is teachers should send notice about things like that. And especially if you're in a community where there's a lot of Native people who are traditional, you just want to give them the opportunity to opt out or to find some alternative. Our grandchild's teacher said if she wants to remain in the classroom, that's perfectly fine. And our granddaughter was good with that. So just need to learn about these things. And that often means talking to individual Native people that you know and trust. I'm going to zoom through the next 5 or 6 slides because you will have access to this list of resources, and I'm just going to characterize them for you. So there are websites about different Native nations. I told you about the news website, Indian Country Today. All these different tribes have their own newspapers and online news. There are also different tribes have their government tribal websites. And then there are many federal websites that do overviews of all the different tribes, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs FAQs website. So there are lots and lots of excellent websites for learning information about tribes. I'm also a fan of Native cartoonists, by the way. There are more and more everyday online resources for cultural perspectives. A lot of them are language sites, and then there are more and more individual Native people who are creating their own blogs and podcasts. Some of them center around particular issues, but there's just every day more and more individual Native people are creating content that they share in social media and on the web and in websites. So there's some of them are specific to certain concerns, and some of them are just Native people being Native people in the 21st century. So much of this is so you will learn something about Native people and not think of them as missing. Um, a couple of really good resources for teachers in New Mexico. One of the best ones is the NACA Inspired Schools Network Resource Hub. That's the Native American Community Academy in Albuquerque. It's been in existence for over 10 years now, I think. They've created a lot of resources for teaching Native students in New Mexico, and they're intertribal, so they're not just Navajo or Pueblo or Apache. They cover a lot of different tribes. For Navajo people, it's coming out this year, I think, a new Diné history textbook that's going to be in at least 2 volumes, I think. The first time that Navajo people have helped develop a public school history textbook for use in New Mexico. I was actually privileged to work on this literature anthology for the Navajo people, the Diné Reader. It's got probably 30 different Navajo poets and writers, and it just came out, I think, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But this book is going to be around for a long time. And if you teach English and high school English, you need to have this book in your classroom. For the Pueblos, they have an Indigenous Wisdom Curriculum project, and they have a website where some of this is downloadable, including STEM standards. There have, in the past few years, been a lot more films and television series that relate to Native concerns generally. And this was from 2 years ago, and this is already way outdated because this year there were more Native films and there are more coming next year. I'm going to have to pause here and ask Tim, how much more time can I take? 10
Well,
minutes?
I want to be respectful of the time of those that need to leave, but if you need to leave, your time will be marked. And you know what, Michael, if you want, I can post their let me share my screen. I'll post that, and then you can continue for a while longer if you want.
Okay. I just want to go through this list of things. I think this is the last part, and I won't talk at any length about anyone. I just want to identify these topics. I can do that maybe in 10 minutes if
Okay.
anybody wants to stay. But if you need to go, I understand that too.
If you need to go, email me tomorrow, and I will forward you the QR code, and your attendance time is marked, time stamped on the Zoom, so you'll be okay.
Okay. All right. So these are issues that non-native people may not be aware of that native people have to pay attention to every day. And some are more intrusive than others. So this may not be a big one to non-native people, but the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, there's a law now. Bottom line is this: there are a lot of remains of our ancestors that are still in museums and in boxes in buildings that were taken by universities and the federal government years ago, and we are still trying to get them back. And there's all kinds of examples of that, but you should just know that we still have missing relatives' remains that have never been properly buried. The truth about res life, and my wife and I live on the res. We have a cabin there. We have cattle there. It's hard. And there's some statistics here. 9 out of 10 families living on the res live in substandard housing, unemployment is close to 50%, and almost every reservation. The list goes on and on. Um, and so that leads to the question, why do we do that? Why do we live in a place where there's hardly any employment, where we have no little lack of infrastructure, where people still haul water? And it's because we're connected to that homeland. And it's because we support native sovereignty and we want to maintain our sovereign nations. My wife is a fluent Navajo speaker, um, and we want to revitalize our languages. We want to honor those relatives who lived there before us, and we want to strengthen our tribal nations into the future for our grandchildren and their children. um, we also have a lot of endangered sacred sites. And this is a list here that's just a very partial list of sacred sites that different tribes consider sacred ground, that are not necessarily protected from public intrusion. So Bears Ears in Utah is probably one of the closest ones to here. It's considered a sacred site by a lot of southwestern tribes, and the tribes want that land protected so it's not developed, where there's not too much tourism, or whether the tourism is managed. There are places that are sacred sites where rock climbers are asked not to climb, but those are the kinds of protections that we need for sacred sites. Facts about Indian gaming. Some people think, oh, all tribes are rich. Well, only 4 out of 10 even have casinos. And this very first statistics, the top 5% of tribes with casinos generate 40% of all revenues. So just because some tribes make a lot of money in casinos, there are other tribes that have casinos, they don't even make that much money. And then there are many majority of tribes that don't even have casinos. So the people that think, oh, all native people get casino money and they all have it in the same way, it's just like everything else. Every tribe is different, and very few tribes are making a significant amount of money from casinos and gambling. Issues in tribal citizenship may be the most important issue for Native people in the modern era, and they have been changing because each tribe, as a sovereign nation, can change its requirements for citizenship. At one time, probably maybe 30 years ago, almost all tribes used the federal requirement of 1/4 blood quantum. So you had to be 25% native blood to be a member of a tribal nation. But over time, some of the tribes have changed that. Many tribes today have what's called lineal descent, meaning the person doesn't have to be 50% or 75%. If they can trace their lineage, their ancestry back to a member of the tribe at a certain point, usually in the early 20th century, like in the early 1900s. If you have an ancestor that was enrolled then and you can trace your ancestry to them, in many tribes, you qualify to be a citizen today. But tribes are going to have to figure this out because blood quantum, whether it's 25% or 50%, if that's the requirement to be a citizen, some tribes will live into extinction that way, because tribal members will marry non-tribal members and their children will be diminishing blood quantum into the future. So tribes have to figure this out. It's really important to us. Many people know about the issues with native mascots. I'll just recommend to you, there's a lady named, I think it's Stephanie Freiberg, who's I think at University of Arizona, who's done a lot of research on the negative impact of native mascots. And I will say this, even in native country, even in native schools and parts of our reservations, we have native mascots we need to get rid of. It's a very complicated cultural issue for some people, and it varies by your location and by your history and your tribe. but many of the negative effects of tribal mascots are well known, and many of them have changed, but not all. The doctrine of discovery is a Catholic doctrine that has been used over time since the beginning of colonization to justify taking land from native people. If you don't know about it, you should learn about it. It's been used even as recently as 2005 in the Supreme Court. The Catholic Church and many other churches have rescinded it or denounced it, but it continues to be used in legal struggles. Many of you know the statistics about the missing and murdered, especially Native women, but also Native men. The statistics are horrible. There have been some progress at having alerts for missing Native people. I think in New Mexico, the state of New Mexico just established, I think it's called a turquoise alert for some missing Native people in New Mexico. But the statistics and the especially on violence against Native people is terrible. I think the last topic is pretendians. Some of you may not know that word, but basically non-Native people who pretend to be Indian. It happens mostly in universities where non-Native academics claim they're Native and they get positions in Native studies and different programs. And this has been going on for a very long time. I would say in the last 5 years, a lot of the people who pretended to be Native have been outed by researchers who are Native, and they've been uncovered. And some people probably are unaware that it even exists. But one of our big music celebrities, Buffy Sainte-Marie, who since the 1960s has claimed to be a Native singer, was exposed in a Canadian public documentary about a year ago that she's always been Italian. Right? And she has pretended for almost 50 years to have been a Native folk singer. She was given all these honors and accolades, and now she's been revealed to be a fraud. So if you just looked up pretendians, you'd find a ton of this, but they are real. And then I'll just leave you with this last slide, which really, for me, I think common sense is the most important thing that we need when we're talking about being culturally responsive. Other people can tell you, but I think your own common sense tells you what it means to look at a student in front of you and want to teach them in a way that fits them culturally and represents their own history and community in your classroom. And I don't think that's that complicated. I think we can figure this out with sensitive teachers who care about the students that sit in front of them. I'll end with this. I grew up going to segregated schools in South Georgia in the 1960s. So I was in a segregated white school. And then my school was integrated in my junior year in high school. And as soon as I began teaching, I was working on faculty with black and white teachers. It took me some years to learn something about black literature. But because the students sitting in front of me were black and had their own rich literature, I read it, I studied it, I talked to my black colleagues, and I could teach black literature. You know, it took me a while, but I knew that was the right thing to do. We all know that. We just need to do it. So I'll end there. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you,
you, Michael.
team. Appreciate it.
If you'll stop your share, I'll get my share up on the.
Okay. What? Oh. Okay. I
Got
should
it.
be good.
I'm working on getting this. Hang on. You have the link in the chat still. And here's the QR code. Let me, oh, I don't know what happened here. Share screen. Can you see it? Did I do it right?
Can you put it in present mode so the slide 4 is bigger?
I don't, let me see what happened. Oh, got it. And then right
There
there.
you go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
I was on the wrong slide.
We'll forgive you.
I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording if I can.